The theater lights dimmed just enough to make the stage glow brighter than the rest of the room. Cameras shifted. The familiar hum of anticipation filled the air, the kind that lives between excitement and judgment. Then he walked out. He wasn't tall, he wasn't flashy, and he didn't command the room the way seasoned performers usually did. Instead, Mateo Cruz stepped onto the stage with careful, almost apologetic movements, as if he were afraid the floor itself might reject him. His jacket, clearly inspired by Elvis, was a little too big at the shoulders, the sleeves slightly long. It looked borrowed, or maybe saved for years, waiting for a moment that might never come. A few people in the audience smiled instinctively. Not cruelly, but not kindly either, the kind of smile that says, "This should be interesting." Mateo stood at center stage, hands folded in front of him. His breathing was shallow. He glanced at the judges, then quickly down at the floor, gathering courage that had taken him decades to grow. "So, what's your name?" the host asked gently. "Mateo," he replied, his voice soft, accented, sincere. "Mateo Cruz." "And where are you from, Mateo?" "I'm from the Philippines," he said, a small proud smile appearing for just a moment before nervousness reclaimed his face. "But I live here now." Simon leaned back in his chair, eyes already scanning Mateo. His posture, his clothes, the way he spoke. He had seen thousands like him, dreamers, hopefuls, people chasing lightning. "And what will you be singing today?" Simon asked. Mateo swallowed. "I'll be singing Elvis Presley." The room reacted instantly. A few chuckles escaped. Someone whispered. A ripple of amusement spread across the audience, not loud, but noticeable. The kind of laughter that doesn't mean harm, but still stings. Mateo heard it. He always did. He smiled awkwardly, nodding as if to say, "Yes, I know what you're thinking." His shoulders lifted in a tiny shrug. "I know," he said softly into the microphone. "People usually laugh first." That single sentence carried more weight than anyone realized, because Mateo wasn't new to this reaction. He had heard it in school when he sang during breaks. He had heard it from coworkers when music played in the kitchen late at night. He had heard it from strangers who assumed his dreams were too big for his accent, his background, his quiet nature. Laughter had followed him longer than applause ever had. Simon raised an eyebrow, a half-smile forming, not mocking, just skeptical. He'd learned to protect himself from disappointment by expecting it. "Elvis is a big choice," Simon said. "Why him?" And Mateo paused. The silence stretched. Then he answered, not with confidence, but with truth. "My father loved Elvis," he said. "He used to play his songs when life was hard." Something shifted, just slightly. The audience quieted. Mateo took a breath, eyes glistening, though he tried to hide it. "When I was a boy," he continued, "we didn't have much, sometimes no electricity, sometimes no food for days, but when my father played those songs, it felt like hope." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from memory. "He passed away when I was young, and singing those songs. It makes me feel like he's still listening." For a moment, even Simon didn't speak, but skepticism still lingered in the air. Because grief alone doesn't win stages, talent does. Mateo nodded politely, as if he sensed that doubt and accepted it. He adjusted the microphone, fingers shaking slightly. His chest rose and fell. Inside his mind, memories flooded in. The long flight to America, the dishwashing job that left his hands cracked and sore, the tiny apartment he shared with 2 other men, the phone calls home where he pretended everything was fine, and the nights, when he sang quietly to himself so no one would hear. Because dreams are fragile things, and ridicule can break them easily. This stage wasn't just a chance, it was a risk. The laughter from earlier still echoed in his ears. It had followed him his whole life. But tonight he wasn't running from it. He stood taller. "Whenever you're ready," the host said. Mateo closed his eyes, not to block out the judges, not to block out the cameras, but to remember who he was singing for. Somewhere beyond the bright lights and polished seats, a fisherman with tired hands and a warm smile seemed to wait. Mateo inhaled slowly. The music had not even started yet. And already the room held its breath, unaware that the laughter they shared seconds ago was about to turn into something else entirely, something unforgettable, The first note hadn't even been sung yet, but Mateo's story had already begun to unfold. As the background music cued softly, Mateo stood still at center stage, eyes closed, breathing measured, like someone preparing not just to sing but to remember. The spotlight warmed his face, yet his mind drifted thousands of miles away, back to a small coastal town in the Philippines, where mornings began with the sound of waves and the smell of salt in the air. Back to a wooden house that creaked in the wind, where walls were thin but love was thick. Back to a father who came home every evening smelling of the sea, shoulders tired, hands rough, but always carrying music with him. Mateo had been barely 6 when he first heard Elvis. It came from an old radio his father found at a flea market, scratched, faded, unreliable. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but on the nights it did, the house transformed. His father would sit by the window, tuning the dial carefully, as if catching a signal from another world. And when the music finally came through crackling but clear enough, he'd smile like a man who had found treasure. "Elvis," his father would say, nodding slowly, "this man sings like he feels everything." Mateo didn't understand English back then. He didn't know the words, but he understood the emotion. He felt it in the way his father's eyes softened, in the way his mother hummed quietly while cooking, in the way the room felt safer when the music played. Music, Mateo learned early, didn't need translation. As he grew older, storms came more often. Some nights, rain battered the roof so hard it felt like the house might float away. Power outages were common. The radio became their light in the dark, sometimes literally. When life was uncertain, Elvis was constant, but childhood, like songs, doesn't last forever. Mateo's father fell ill when Mateo was 13. The fishing trips stopped, the radio played less often, and one quiet morning the house felt emptier than it ever had before. The sea took his father back. In the weeks that followed, Mateo stopped singing altogether. The radio sat untouched. Silence filled the rooms where music once lived, until one evening his mother found him holding the radio, tears streaming down his face. "Sing," she whispered. He would want that. That was the first time Mateo sang alone. Not for an audience, not for applause, but for healing. Years passed. Life demanded practicality. Mateo worked odd jobs. He helped his mother. He learned responsibility early. Dreams were something you packed away when survival came first. Then came the decision that changed everything. America, a place spoken of in whispers, a place of opportunity, but also distance. Mateo promised he would help his family. He promised he would return successful. What he didn't promise, because he couldn't, was that he wouldn't feel invisible. In America, Mateo became a number on a schedule, a pair of hands in a kitchen, a quiet worker who never complained and never missed a shift. His English improved, but his accent never left, and sometimes people mistook that for weakness. At night, when the restaurant closed and the floor was finally quiet, Mateo would hum softly while cleaning. One night, a co-worker laughed. "You sing Elvis." He joked, "You don't look like Elvis." Mateo smiled politely and lowered his voice. He always lowered his voice, because it was safer to be quiet than to be judged. But silence has a cost. Every dollar Mateo earned he sent home, for school fees, for medicine, for hope. He lived small so others could live better. His dreams survived only in the moments no one could see. Until one day, scrolling through his phone during a break, Mateo saw an audition announcement. Your voice could change everything. He laughed at first. Then he remembered his father. He remembered the radio. He remembered how music once made the world feel kinder, and he applied. Now, standing on the stage, Mateo felt the weight of every step that brought him here, the miles, the sacrifices, the nights of doubt. The laughter he endured. This performance wasn't about fame. It was about being heard, if only once. "I didn't come here to win." Mateo had said earlier, barely above a whisper, "I came here to honor where I came from." The music swelled softly. The judges watched, the audience leaned forward, and as Mateo opened his eyes, something inside him shifted. Not confidence, not courage, but acceptance. Whatever happened next, He had already crossed the hardest distance of all. From silence to sound, the music began almost timidly. A single chord floated through the theater, gentle and unassuming, like it was testing the air before daring to exist. Mateo didn't move at first. His hands remained at his sides, his eyes stayed closed. Then he sang, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a softness that felt intentional, like a secret being shared rather than a performance being given. Wise men say, only fools rush in. A few audience members exchanged glances. The voice was pleasant, controlled, respectful of the song, but still nothing extraordinary. Simon tilted his head slightly, fingers tapping against the table. He had heard hundreds of competent singers. Talent alone wasn't enough. Mateo kept going. Each word landed carefully, as if he were placing memories instead of notes. His accent colored the lyrics, not as a flaw, but as a signature. It gave the song a vulnerability that felt raw, human, and then something subtle happened. Mateo stopped trying to sound like Elvis. Instead, he sounded like himself. The second verse arrived, and the tone shifted, almost imperceptibly at first. His voice grew warmer, fuller. The restraint he'd been holding onto began to loosen, like a tide pulling back before a wave. The audience leaned in, not because they were impressed yet, but because they sensed something coming. Mateo's chest rose higher with each breath. His shoulders relaxed. His grip on the microphone tightened, not from fear, but from focus. Inside his mind, the stage faded. He was no longer under blinding lights. He was back in that wooden house by the sea, back to the sound of rain on the roof, back to a radio crackling in the corner, back to a father who believed music could carry you through anything. Then came the bridge. The moment every singer fears, the place where voices either break or reveal themselves. Mateo opened his eyes. For the first time since walking onto the stage, he looked directly at the judges, and he sang. The note didn't explode. It rose, clear, strong, honest, not shouted, not forced, but carried on a breath that held years of grief, sacrifice, and unspoken longing. The room changed instantly. The audience went still. No coughing, no whispering, no movement. Even the cameras seemed to slow. Simon leaned forward, his expression shifting from polite interest to disbelief. His pen stopped mid-air. His lips parted slightly, as if his mind were trying to catch up with what his ears were hearing. That note wasn't just technically impressive. It was earned. It was the sound of someone who had waited a lifetime to be heard, and refused to waste the moment. Mateo held it, not for show, but for truth. You could hear the control, you could feel the emotion trembling just beneath it. A woman in the audience wiped her eyes, a man pressed his hand to his chest, one of the judges whispered, "Wow," without realizing it. Then Mateo released the note gently, letting it fall back into silence. For a heartbeat no one reacted, because sometimes the most powerful moments don't invite applause, they demand reflection. Mateo continued the song, but now the energy was different. The laughter from earlier felt like a distant memory. This was no longer a joke. This was testimony. Every lyric carried weight now. His voice filled the theater, not with volume but with presence. The song built naturally, as if following the rhythm of his life. When he reached the final chorus, he didn't push. He trusted the story, and in that trust, the performance became unforgettable. The last note faded into the air, hanging there fragile, beautiful, complete. Mateo lowered the microphone slightly. His hands trembled, his eyes glistened. He exhaled, unaware he had been holding his breath for the entire song. Silence followed, not awkward silence, reverent silence. The kind that says something sacred just happened. Then, slowly, someone stood, then another and another, until the entire theater rose to its feet. The applause didn't erupt, it washed over the room like a wave, thunderous and unrestrained. Cheers echoed. People clapped until their hands ached, as if trying to tell Mateo everything words could not. Mateo covered his mouth, tears finally spilling free. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He bowed his head slightly, not in pride, but in gratitude, and as he looked up, he saw Simon standing too, not smiling, not clapping politely, but staring at Mateo with genuine awe. Because in all his years of judging voices, Simon had learned one truth: you can train technique, but you cannot manufacture soul, and Mateo had just filled the room with it. The applause didn't fade quickly. It lingered, rolling through the theater like thunder that refused to leave. Hands clapped until palms burned. Cheers rose from every corner. Some people shouted Mateo's name, though many had only just learned it moments ago. Mateo stood frozen at center stage. His knees felt weak, his chest felt tight, and his eyes could no longer hold back the tears. He pressed his fingers to his lips, overwhelmed by the sound of approval he had never expected to hear in his lifetime. This wasn't polite applause. This was recognition. This was the sound of being seen. When the noise finally softened, Mateo wiped his face with the sleeve of his jacket, embarrassed but grateful. He glanced at the judges' table, unsure of what came next. Simon Cowell was still standing. That alone felt unreal. Simon, known for his sharp words and impossible standards, wasn't clapping anymore. He was simply looking at Mateo, thoughtful, quiet, deeply moved. The skeptical smile from earlier was gone, replaced by something far rarer. Respect. Simon leaned toward his microphone but then paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. The audience gasped softly. Mateo's heart skipped. "I'll be honest," Simon continued. "When you walked out here, I thought this was going to be entertaining in a different way." A few knowing laughs echoed, quickly fading. "But what you just did," Simon said, his voice firm now, "was remind us why this stage exists." Mateo bowed his head slightly, listening. "You didn't come out here to show off," Simon said. "You didn't try to imitate Elvis. You didn't rely on tricks. You sang with truth, and that's something you can't teach." For a moment, Simon stopped speaking. His eyes glistened. "I've heard thousands of singers," he said quietly. "Very few make me forget I'm judging. You did." The theater erupted again, but Simon raised his hand gently, asking for silence, not to control the room, but to protect the moment. Mateo's breathing shook. Tears streamed freely now. He didn't bother wiping them away. One of the other judges leaned forward. "Mateo," she said warmly, "where did you learn to sing like that?" Mateo laughed softly through tears. "I learned by listening," he replied, "and by feeling." Another judge asked, "Did you ever think you'd be standing here?" Mateo shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "I almost didn't come." The audience murmured. "I told myself this was for people braver than me." He continued, "People who belong on big stages. I'm just someone who sings when he misses home." The words hit harder than any note he'd sung. Simon leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. "That," he said, "is exactly why you belong here." Mateo's shoulders collapsed slightly, as if a lifetime of tension had finally released. Simon stood again, placing both hands on the table. "People at home need to hear this," he said, now addressing the camera. "Talent doesn't always come dressed the way you expect. Sometimes it comes quietly. Sometimes it comes with an accent. And sometimes, if you're not careful, you miss it because you're too busy judging the cover." Mateo covered his face, sobbing now, not from sadness, but from relief. Years of silence, years of doubt, years of shrinking himself, all undone by a few words spoken with sincerity. Simon turned back to Mateo. "You honored your father today," he said gently, "and you honored this song." Mateo looked up, eyes red. "Thank you," he whispered. "He would have loved this." Simon smiled, a real smile, "and so do we." The host stepped forward, voice trembling with emotion. "Mateo," he said, "this stage has changed lives before, but tonight you changed us." The audience stood again, applause roaring louder than before. Mateo bowed deeply, not as a performer, but as a son, a dreamer, and a man who had finally been met with kindness instead of laughter. For the first time, he wasn't standing alone. He was held by the room. The lights slowly dimmed as Mateo walked off the stage, but the moment didn't end there. If anything, it was only beginning. Backstage, the noise from the theater still echoed faintly. Applause leaking through walls, cheers refusing to fade. Mateo stood alone for a moment, leaning against a cool concrete wall, his hands trembling as he tried to understand what had just happened. Just minutes earlier, he had walked onto that stage prepared to be laughed at. Now he had walked off hurt. A production assistant gently placed a bottle of water in his hand. Another gave him a quiet smile and said, "That was beautiful." Mateo nodded, unable to speak. His throat felt tight, not from singing, but from the weight of a lifetime suddenly lifted. When he finally pulled out his phone, it buzzed nonstop. Missed calls, messages, names he hadn't seen in years. One message stood out, "Nane, I felt your father tonight." Mateo sat down slowly, tears returned, but this time they were warm, full of gratitude instead of pain. Across the ocean, in that same small coastal town, his mother had watched on a tiny screen, hands clasped, whispering prayers of thanks. Music had crossed borders, so had love. The clip of Mateo's performance spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours it was everywhere, shared by strangers who saw themselves in his story, immigrants, dreamers, workers who labored quietly while carrying big hopes inside them. Comments poured in. "I've never cried at a singing show before. That note healed something in me. He reminds me of my dad. I almost gave up on my dream. Thank you for this." Mateo read them late into the night, sitting on the edge of his bed in his small apartment. Each message felt like a hand reaching out, saying, "You are not alone." The next morning he returned to work, same kitchen, same sink, same cracked tiles beneath his feet, but something was different. People noticed him now. Not because he was famous, but because he stood differently. Straighter, lighter, as if the world had finally made room for him. A coworker stopped him and said, "I saw you on TV." Mateo smiled shyly. Another added, "You made my mom cry." Mateo laughed softly, humbled. Days later, Simon spoke about the audition in an interview. "Moments like that," he said, "are why I still do this, because sometimes someone walks in carrying a lifetime of silence and reminds us all to listen better." Mateo didn't win that season, but he gained something far more lasting. He gained belief. Opportunities came, not all glamorous, but meaningful. Small concerts, community events, charity performances, places where people didn't just want to hear him sing. They wanted to hear his story. And every time Mateo stepped onto a stage, no matter how small, he remembered that first moment of laughter, not with bitterness, but with gratitude, because it reminded him how powerful kindness can be, especially when it replaces judgment. One evening, after a modest performance at a local hall, a young boy approached him. "I'm scared to sing," the boy admitted. "People laugh at me too." Mateo knelt down to his level. "They laughed at me too," he said gently. "But that doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means they haven't heard you yet." The boy smiled. Years from now, Mateo would remember that moment more than any applause, because impact isn't measured by stages or spotlights, but by hearts changed. On quiet nights, Mateo still sang Elvis, sometimes alone, sometimes for others, always with meaning, and somewhere, in the hush between notes, he felt his father listening. The world would remember Mateo as the Filipino Elvis singer who shocked the judges. But Mateo knew the truth. He wasn't remembered because of a note. He was remembered because he dared to be honest, kind, and brave, even when the world laughed first. And that is how one voice, carried by humility and heart, reminded millions of something simple and powerful. Never underestimate a quiet dream or the courage it takes to finally let it sing.